Everyone in that courtroom thought they already knew how the story would end. A cold sentence, a convenient culprit, and another innocent man crushed by the power of a wealthy rival. But everything changed the moment a frail yet unwavering voice shattered the silence. "Free my son, and you will walk again." The judge laughed, a harsh, bitter sound from a man who no longer believed in anything beyond his own cynicism. Yet in that instant, something unseen rippled through the room. A collective shiver, a silent warning that the impossible was about to invade the logical world of the law. Because sometimes justice doesn't walk through the door. It breaks it wide open. The silence in the courtroom was a physical weight, pressing down on every shoulder, stifling every breath. It smelled of old wood, decades of stale coffee, and the quiet, suffocating finality of judgment. From his elevated bench, a dark oak throne that had also been his prison for 20 years, Judge Alistair Finch surveyed the room. His face was a mask of chiseled cynicism, his authority as sharp and unyielding as the crease in his black robes. Below him stood Daniel, a local artisan whose hands, usually covered in sawdust and known for creating beauty from raw timber, were now bound in cold steel cuffs. Daniel's integrity was as well known in their small town as the scent of pine from his workshop, a quiet, stoic resilience that had earned him respect, not through vast wealth or a sprawling business, but through the simple honesty of his craft. He was on trial for financial sabotage. The accusation was a bitter irony that he had deliberately ruined the very community center project he had poured his heart and soul into. The prosecution had presented a mountain of evidence, cleverly forged invoices, manipulated bank statements, and testimonies twisted by fear and greed. It was a masterpiece of deceit, orchestrated by a man sitting in the front row, his chief business rival, Marcus Thorne. Marcus, whose family had built a considerable fortune through aggressive real estate deals and shrewd stock market investments, seethed with a venomous envy for the one thing his money couldn't buy, the genuine admiration the town held for Daniel. His goal wasn't just to win a contract, it was to shatter the man's reputation, to grind his spirit into dust. Judge Finch's gaze was cold, unmoved by the quiet dignity Daniel projected. For 2 decades, a wheelchair had been his world. A tragic accident had stolen his legs, and over the years it had chipped away at his compassion, leaving behind a man who believed only in the cold, hard logic of the law. He saw emotion as a weakness, a variable that corrupted the pure mathematics of justice. In his mind, the case was closed. The numbers on the forged documents added up. The testimonies, however coerced, were on the record. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He cleared his throat, the sound scraping through the tense silence, and prepared to deliver the sentence that would seal Daniel's fate. But before he could speak, a voice, frail yet shockingly firm, cut through the air. "Judge!" All eyes turned to Daniel's mother, Ilara. She was a small, fragile woman, her body stooped with age. But she rose unsteadily to her feet, her eyes locking onto the judges with a fiery, unshakable faith that seemed to defy the very laws of the room. The gallery held its breath. "This man," she declared, her voice echoing with an unnerving, prophetic certainty, "is innocent. Free him, and you will walk again." A wave of shocked gasps and frantic murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff took a step toward her, but froze. Judge Finch's face, already a storm cloud of impatience, darkened into something thunderous. A short, guttural sound escaped his lips, not a chuckle, but a harsh, grating laugh of pure derision. It was the sound of a man who had long ago stopped believing in anything he couldn't see or touch. He leaned forward, his knuckles white on the armrests of his chair. "Another outburst like that, old woman, and I'll have you held in contempt of court," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. He didn't wait for a response. He lifted his gavel high, the polished wood catching the dim courtroom light, and brought it down with a deafening crack that felt like a gunshot. "Guilty!" The word hung in the air, a final brutal nail in the coffin of Daniel's life. Two officers moved to his side, their hands gentle but firm on his arms. Daniel looked at his mother, his expression not of defeat, but of profound protective love. He was being led away, the heavy doors of the courtroom swinging shut behind him. But it was his mother's impossible words that remained, echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. They hung there not as a plea, but as something far more powerful, something that felt terrifyingly like a curse or a promise. The world outside the courtroom doors was a blur. Daniel was processed, his civilian clothes replaced with a drab numbered uniform that stripped him of his identity. The low-security facility was a landscape of concrete and chain-link fences, a sterile, grey world so far removed from the warm, fragrant chaos of his workshop that it felt like another planet. His life, once measured by the grain of wood and the satisfaction of a finished piece, was now measured by the clang of steel doors and the long, empty hours stretching into an endless horizon of injustice. The weight of the sentence wasn't in the years, but in the crushing finality of it. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that his name was now synonymous with fraud, his reputation a ruin. The first blow landed just 3 days in. A letter arrived, not from his mother, but from the prestigious law firm she had hired with what little savings she had. It was a crisp, formal letter expressing deep regret. His lawyer, a compassionate man who had seemed genuinely convinced of Daniel's innocence, was forced to withdraw. A sudden family crisis, a medical emergency overseas, required his immediate and indefinite attention. The glimmer of hope that a skilled attorney might unravel Marcus Thorne's web of lies was extinguished in an instant. He was assigned a public defender, a man named Arthur Vance, who visited him the following week. Vance was a man worn smooth by the system, his eyes holding the permanent fatigue of someone who had seen too many battles lost before they even began. He flipped through Daniel's case file with a practiced disinterest. "Look," he said, not unkindly, but with a weary resignation that was far worse. "The evidence is stacked. Thorne's lawyers are sharks. My advice? Keep your head down, serve your time. You might get out early for good behavior." He saw a closed case, another number in a long line of them. Not an innocent man. The door to a successful appeal had just been slammed shut and bolted. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne was playing the part of the magnanimous victor. An article appeared in the local paper, complete with a somber photo of Marcus looking thoughtfully into the distance. He spoke of forgiveness, of the town's need to heal. He offered a hollow prayer for Daniel, expressing a hope that he would find his way back to the right path. It was a calculated, brilliant move. To the town, it cemented his image as a gracious leader, a victim who was nonetheless rising above the fray. To Daniel, reading the article on a crumpled paper in the prison library, it was like having salt ground into an open wound. Marcus wasn't just content with winning. He was dancing on the grave of Daniel's reputation. But his cruelty had a far sharper edge. A week later, a frantic, tearful call from his mother confirmed his deepest fears. Marcus's family, through one of their many real estate holdings, owned the small house Ilara had rented for 30 years. An eviction notice had been served. The reason given was flimsy, a need for unspecified renovations. But the message was brutally clear. It was a threat, a tool of leverage designed to silence the one voice that still dared to proclaim his innocence. That was the turning point. The despair that had settled over Daniel like a shroud was burned away by a sudden, white-hot rage. This was no longer about his own freedom or his shattered name. It was about his mother. He would not let that man take her home, her security, her peace. The resolve to fight, which had been extinguished, was reignited into a desperate, roaring flame. Ilara, for her part, refused to be broken. Armed with nothing but her unwavering faith and a dusty box of Daniel's old business records, she began a lonely, methodical investigation from her small kitchen table. She spent hours poring over years of receipts, invoices, and supplier logs, her arthritic fingers tracing lines of ink, praying for a single inconsistency, a single crack in Marcus's perfect fabrication. And then she found it. Tucked into an old ledger was a fuel receipt from a gas station 2 towns over, dated and time-stamped for the exact hour the prosecution claimed Daniel was electronically transferring funds to a ghost account. It was an alibi, a small, simple, perfect piece of paper that could unravel the entire lie. Hope, brilliant and blinding, surged through her. Back in his chambers, surrounded by towering shelves of law books that represented a lifetime of logic and reason, Judge Finch was agitated. The courthouse felt different, the silence in his office no longer peaceful but accusatory. He found himself rereading the transcripts of Daniel's trial, his eyes drawn again and again to Ilara's impossible declaration. "Free him, and you will walk again." He dismissed it as the desperate rambling of an old woman, but the words had lodged in his mind like a splinter. They unnerved him, mocking his carefully constructed world of facts and evidence. One night, as a violent thunderstorm raged outside, rattling the tall windows of his chambers, he was angrily reviewing the case files one last time, determined to purge the lingering doubt. As lightning bleached the room white, a sudden shocking jolt shot through his legs. It was a flicker of fire, a deep muscular spasm of sensation in limbs that had been numb and useless for 20 years. He gasped, dropping the file as his hands flew to his thighs. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only a tingling echo. A cruel phantom nerve firing, he told himself. A trick of his mind, brought on by stress and the storm. But as the thunder rolled away, a seed of terrifying, impossible doubt had been planted in the barren soil of his certainty. That single, terrifying seed of doubt began to sprout in the days that followed, growing like a weed through the cracks in the judge's hardened convictions. He tried to ignore it, to bury it under piles of new case files and the familiar, rigid routine of the court. But every time he wheeled himself through the hallowed halls, every time he sat upon his bench, the echo of that impossible prophecy followed him. It was a ghost in his own mind, whispering a question he dared not ask. What if? Miles away, in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office, Arthur Vance was asking a different kind of question. He was sifting through the boxes left by Daniel's previous, high-priced lawyer, a task he resented. It felt like cleaning up another man's mess. Most of it was standard legal boilerplate, but in the bottom of one box, he found a dusty, forgotten file, completely unrelated to Daniel's case. The label was faded. Thorn Real Estate versus State Commerce Commission, 1998. Curiosity piqued. He opened it. It detailed a corporate fraud investigation against Marcus Thorn's father. The case had been dismissed on a technicality, but the investigators' notes were meticulous. They outlined a unique and fiendishly complex method of hiding funds through a series of shell corporations and manipulated asset valuations. A way to make capital vanish into thin air and reappear as legitimate profit. Arthur read it with a flicker of professional admiration for the sheer audacity of the scheme. Seeing no immediate connection to Daniel, he shrugged and set the old file aside on a corner of his desk, a forgotten piece of history. Yet the intricate details of the fraud lingered in the back of his mind. A solution waiting for a problem. At that very moment, Ilara was clutching what she believed was the key to everything. The fuel receipt felt as precious as a bar of gold in her trembling hands. She made an appointment with Arthur Vance, her heart soaring with a hope so fierce it made her dizzy. She laid the small piece of paper on his desk like a winning lottery ticket. "He wasn't there," she explained, her voice trembling with conviction. "He couldn't have made the transfer. He was buying gas 2 towns away. This proves it." Arthur examined the receipt. His expression was one of practiced patience, the look of a man who had seen countless desperate families cling to flimsy hopes. "Mrs. Miller," he began gently, "a receipt can be disputed. They'll say he had someone else use his card, or that the timestamp is wrong." But seeing the fire in her eyes, he sighed. "All right, I'll have an investigator look into it. We'll check the gas station security footage." 2 days later, the call came. The hope that had carried Ilara through the week was brutally extinguished. The investigator's report was short and final. The gas station's security system had suffered a power surge that very day, wiping all the footage from that week. The clerk who had been on duty, a young man who had only worked there a month, had quit and moved away without a forwarding address. It was a dead end. A perfect, impenetrable, and deeply suspicious dead end. The receipt was now just a worthless piece of paper, a cruel mirage in a vast desert of injustice. The defeat was a physical blow, leaving Ilara breathless at her kitchen table, the silence of her small home pressing in on her. For Daniel, the silence was a luxury he couldn't afford. The prison buzzed with the low hum of animosity. News traveled fast. The inmates, many of whom were from the same working-class stock as Daniel, saw him not as a fellow victim of the system, but as a traitor. He was the respected artisan, the man who was supposed to be better than them, who had built a reputation on integrity. His conviction confirmed their deepest cynicism, that everyone, no matter how righteous they seemed, had a price. The whispers followed him in the yard, the taunts were muttered in the chow line. "Hey, Mr. Community, how's that big project coming along?" one would sneer. "Guess his investments didn't pay off," another would chuckle. He was isolated, a pariah in a world of outcasts. The psychological torment was relentless, chipping away at his stoic resilience until he felt himself crumbling from the inside. He hit his lowest point one afternoon, sitting on the edge of his cot, the grey walls of his cell closing in, the weight of his mother's eviction notice, and the futility of his situation crushing the very breath from his lungs. He was on the verge of surrendering, of letting the bitterness consume him completely. It was then that an older man, an inmate named Samuel who rarely spoke, sat down on the opposite cot. Samuel had been inside for 30 years, a quiet, a ghost-like figure who moved through the prison with a stillness that was both unnerving and profound. He had been convicted of a robbery homicide, a crime everyone, including the guards, now quietly believed he didn't commit. "They build a story," Samuel said, his voice raspy from disuse, not looking at Daniel but at the concrete floor. "Once the story is built, it's easier for everyone to believe it than to tear it down. Doesn't matter if it's true." He then told Daniel his own story, a simple, heartbreaking tale of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of a system that needed a conviction more than it needed the truth. There was no grand speech, no call to arms. It was just a quiet moment of shared understanding, a recognition of the same profound injustice reflected in another man's eyes. In that shared moment, something shifted in Daniel. He saw in Samuel's unbroken spirit a testament to human endurance. The despair didn't vanish, but the small, dying ember of his resolve was fanned by a sudden gust of purpose. He would not break. He would endure, not just for his mother, but for Samuel, and for the simple, defiant act of holding on to the truth when the entire world had accepted a lie. That same week, Judge Finch was obligated to attend the town's annual Founders' Day charity gala. It was a duty he despised. The crowded ballroom, the sea of smiling faces, the endless small talk, it all served to amplify his confinement. He sat near the stage, a stoic, unmoving island, in a river of elegantly dressed people, his wheelchair a constant glaring reminder of his separateness. As the mayor droned on about community spirit, the judge reached into his vest pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, cool metal of a pocket watch. It had been a gift from his late wife, Eleanor, its gentle ticking a faint, steady heartbeat that had comforted him for over 2 decades. He was checking the time when it happened. It wasn't a flicker this time, not a phantom jolt. It was a violent, undeniable muscle spasm, a brutal contraction that seized both his legs at once. His entire lower body lurched, kicking out with a force he hadn't possessed in 20 years. The wheelchair bucked beneath him. A gasp escaped his lips, a raw, involuntary sound. The precious pocket watch flew from his grasp, tumbling through the air in a slow, golden arc before landing on the marble floor with a sickening crunch of glass and gears. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. For a moment, he was frozen, the shock of the physical sensation warring with the dawning horror of what he had just lost. The mayor stopped mid-sentence. A few people rushed forward to help, their faces a mixture of pity and alarm. "I'm fine," the judge snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He waved them away, his gaze fixed on the shattered remains of the watch, its ticking heart forever silenced. The physical shock was immense, but it was nothing compared to the terrifying wonder that was blooming in his chest. The woman's words echoed in his mind, no longer a distant memory, but a deafening roar. "Free him, and you will walk again." It was no longer a joke. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a haunting, terrifying possibility that threatened to shatter the very foundations of his logical world. He didn't stay for the rest of the gala. Back in the cold sanctuary of his chambers, the broken watch lay on his desk, a testament to the inexplicable event. The cynicism that had been his armor for 20 years was cracking, falling away to reveal a raw, terrified man beneath. He was a man of law, of evidence and precedent, but what he was experiencing defied all logic. Driven by a frantic need to understand, to find a rational explanation where none existed, he wheeled himself to the court's records room. He pulled the files for Daniel's case, not just the trial transcripts, but every piece of discovery, every financial statement, every preliminary report. He was no longer a judge seeking to confirm guilt. He was a detective searching desperately for a single, overlooked shred of doubt. His sharp legal mind, once a tool for conviction, was now a scalpel for deconstruction. He worked through the night, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of dread. The prosecution's case was, on the surface, airtight, but the judge wasn't looking at the surface anymore. He was looking for the cracks. And then, in the early hours of the morning, under the harsh glare of his desk lamp, he found it. It was a tiny accounting anomaly, a single data point in a sea of numbers that didn't quite add up. A transfer of capital that was routed through an obscure offshore holding company for less than a nanosecond before arriving in its fraudulent destination. It was almost invisible, a ghost in the machine designed to be missed by a standard audit. He had seen it during the trial, but dismissed it as an irrelevant quirk in the system. Now it screamed at him. This wasn't a quirk, it was a signature. The coincidence was too perfect, too elegant to be random. A surge of adrenaline hit him. Who would use such a complex method for a relatively small case of local sabotage? This was the work of someone with a deep, practiced knowledge of high-level financial crime. On a hunch, he requested the archives pull all prior litigation involving Thorne family businesses. An hour later, a clerk wheeled in a trolley laden with dusty, forgotten files. He started digging, his heart pounding in his chest, and there it was, a file from 1998, detailing a state investigation into Marcus Thorne's father for corporate fraud. As he read the investigator's notes, his blood ran cold. The report detailed a unique, sophisticated method of hiding funds using lightning-fast transfers through a specific type of shell corporation. It was the exact same method, the same ghost in the machine. It was a family recipe for crime, passed down from father to son. The case against Daniel wasn't just built on lies. It was built on a foundation of inherited, expert-level corruption. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Daniel was innocent, utterly and completely innocent, and he, Judge Alistair Finch, had condemned him. The realization was not a quiet dawn, but a violent collision. The gavel he had slammed down echoed in his memory, not as an instrument of justice, but as the hammer that had forged an innocent man's chains. He stared at the shattered pocket watch, its delicate gears exposed and broken, a perfect metaphor for his own life's work. 2 decades of pride, of unshakable faith in the system he served, lay in ruins on his desk. He, Judge Alistair Finch, a man who prided himself on logic and impartiality, had been a pawn in a game of inherited greed, blinded by his own cynicism and a perfectly crafted lie. The shame was a physical sickness, churning in his gut. Every legal principle he held sacred had been violated, not by the man in the prison cell, but by the man on the bench. Just as this crushing weight threatened to suffocate him, the morning news delivered another blow. A local news channel was running a segment live from the steps of the municipal hospital. There, smiling into the cameras, was Marcus Thorne. He stood beside the hospital administrator, presenting a comically oversized check. The donation was staggering, enough to fully fund the construction of a new state-of-the-art accessibility wing, a project the judge himself had championed for years, a cause deeply personal to him. Marcus spoke eloquently about civic duty, about the importance of community, and about how his family's business, built on a fortune of shrewd investments and capital growth, was committed to giving back. It was a masterstroke of public relations, a blatant and obscene attempt to purchase goodwill and influence. He was polishing his halo with the very money he'd stolen, using Daniel's ruin as a stepping stone to sainthood. To the judge, it felt like a personal taunt. Marcus was not just buying favor, he was flaunting his power, demonstrating that with enough money, even justice could be treated as another asset to be acquired. The public display of philanthropy had its intended effect. The story dominated the local news cycle, painting Marcus as a benevolent pillar of the community. The pressure mounted, calls were made. The court, eager to appear responsive and put the unpleasant matter of the community center sabotage to rest, acted swiftly. The notice arrived on Arthur Vance's desk less than an hour later. It was a cold, formal court order. The final sentencing hearing for Daniel Miller had been moved up. It was no longer weeks away. It was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Less than 48 hours. Arthur stared at the paper, a bitter taste in his mouth. It was a death sentence for any chance of a meaningful appeal. He knew exactly what it was, the system clearing the board, tying up loose ends now that the public had its hero and its villain neatly defined. The immense wealth of the Thorne family was not just in their bank accounts or their stock portfolio. It was in their ability to bend the world to their will. The drive to the facility was grim. Arthur had to deliver the news to Daniel, a task that felt like telling a man on life support that you were about to pull the plug. He found Daniel in the yard, standing apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the distant trees beyond the fence. When Arthur told him, Daniel didn't rage or break down. A quiet, heavy stillness settled over him, the look of a man who had already braced for the worst impact, only to be told a worse one was coming. 48 hours, Daniel repeated, the words barely a whisper. There's nothing we can do, is there? Arthur wished he could offer some hope, but he was a realist. I'll file for a continuance, but with the press from Thorne's donation, "It won't be granted. I'm sorry, Daniel. They're closing the book on this." Back in his chambers, Judge Finch was in a state of controlled panic. Time was running out. He had the truth locked away in a dusty file from 1998, but he was trapped within the gilded cage of his own authority. If he simply produced the evidence himself, questions would be asked. Why was he reinvestigating a closed case? How did he find this obscure file? It would trigger a judicial review, a scandal that would not only end his career, but could potentially taint the entire case, allowing Marcus to walk free on a technicality. The irony was agonizing. To uphold the law, he had to operate outside of its normal channels. He needed Arthur Vance to find that file, but how? He couldn't call him, he couldn't send an anonymous tip. It had to appear as if the disillusioned public defender had discovered it himself through his own due diligence. The judge looked at the stack of boxes from the original lawyer, still sitting in a corner of the evidence room. An idea, a desperate, risky idea, beginning to form in his mind. He had to plant the seed of truth and pray that it would be found in time. His mind, a well-oiled machine of legal strategy, worked furiously. He couldn't be the source. The evidence had to surface organically through the proper channels, however corrupted they might be. His gaze fell upon the clerk's log for the evidence room. The boxes from Daniel's first lawyer were still there, sealed and catalogued. They were Arthur Vance's responsibility now. A desperate plan, fraught with risk, began to solidify. It was a gross violation of judicial ethics, an act that could see him disbarred and disgraced. But the alternative, letting an innocent man rot while a criminal was celebrated as a philanthropist, was a violation of a much higher law. That night, long after the custodians had finished their rounds and the courthouse had settled into a deep, echoing silence, Judge Finch wheeled himself from his chambers. The building felt like a tomb, his movements unnervingly loud in the stillness. He navigated the dark corridors to the records room, the key turning in the lock with a click that sounded like a confession. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and time. He found the trolley with the Thorne family litigation files and, with straining effort, pulled the 1998 fraud case from the stack. Then he located the sealed boxes belonging to Daniel's case. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he carefully sliced the evidence tape on one of the boxes, slipped the old, dusty file deep inside among stacks of legal pads and depositions, and resealed it with painstaking precision. It looked untouched. The next morning, a new court order appeared on Arthur Vance's desk. It was from Judge Finch. It mandated a full reinventory and summary of all discovery materials transferred from previous counsel to be submitted to the court by 8 a.m. on the day of the sentencing. Arthur read it and swore under his breath. It was pure bureaucratic harassment, a pointless, time-consuming task designed to add another layer of misery to an already impossible situation. "What is his problem?" he muttered to the empty office, tossing the order onto a pile of other hopeless cases. It was busy work, likely the judge's petty way of asserting his authority. With a heavy sigh, he requested the boxes from the evidence clerk. He would have to work through the night. Hours later, Arthur's office was a disaster of scattered papers. He was bleary-eyed, fueled by bitter coffee, sifting through the debris of another lawyer's failed strategy. He was halfway through the third box, his movements mechanical, when his fingers brushed against a file that felt different, older, its cardboard cover softened with age. He pulled it out. Thorne Real Estate versus State Commerce Commission 1998. It was the same file he had glanced at and dismissed days ago. He almost tossed it aside again, but the judge's inexplicable order had put him on edge. Why make him do this? Was there something he was supposed to find? He opened it, not with any real hope, but with the weary curiosity of a man who had nothing left to lose. He began to read the investigator's notes again, this time more slowly. The description of the fraud was incredibly detailed. It wasn't just about shell corporations, it was about a specific software algorithm that sliced a large sum of capital into thousands of microtransactions, routed them through a dozen offshore servers in a specific sequence, and reassembled them in under a second, leaving a financial footprint so faint it was practically invisible. The report called it a digital ghost, a phrase from the report snagged in his memory. The transaction is designed to appear as a system glitch or an irrelevant accounting anomaly to a standard audit. Anomaly. The word sparked like a flint in the darkness of his mind. He scrambled through the mess on his desk, searching for Daniel's financial discovery. He found the prosecution's forensic accounting report and flipped to the page detailing the fraudulent transfer. And there it was, a single sentence he had read and dismissed a dozen times, a note from the accountant. A minor unresolvable anomaly was detected in the transfer routing, consistent with a network server lag, deemed irrelevant to the outcome. It wasn't a lag, it was the ghost. It was the exact same signature method, the family recipe for financial crime, described in a dusty file from 20 years ago. Arthur Vance shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The coffee cup on his desk tipped over, spilling a dark stain across a stack of papers, but he didn't notice. The fatigue, the cynicism, the weary resignation, it all evaporated in a single blinding flash of adrenaline. This wasn't a lost cause. It was a conspiracy, and he was holding the proof. He looked at the clock on the wall. He had less than 36 hours to unravel a crime 2 decades in the making and save an innocent man. The day of the final sentencing arrived like a shroud falling over the town. The courtroom was packed again, but the nervous murmurs of the first trial were gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. It was the silence of a foregone conclusion, of a community coming to witness the final act of a tragedy. Marcus Thorne sat in the front row, a model of somber civic duty, accepting quiet condolences from his associates. His expression was one of reluctant duty, but his eyes held the unmistakable glint of triumph. Daniel was led in, his shoulders slumped, the fight seemingly gone from him. He looked for his mother in the gallery. She was there, in the same seat as before. Her face was etched with worry, a roadmap of sleepless nights. But when their eyes met, she gave him a small, determined nod. It was a gesture that said, "I still believe." Even if he was no longer sure, he did himself. Then the side door opened, and Judge Finch wheeled himself to the bench. He looked different. The usual mask of cold impatience was gone, replaced by something unreadable, a deep, harrowing turmoil that seemed to have aged him a decade overnight. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked out over the entire room, as if seeing it for the first time, a stage upon which a great injustice was about to be consecrated. He arranged the papers before him, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate weight. The silence in the room deepened, becoming absolute. "This court is now in session," the bailiff's voice boomed, and then there was only the sound of the judge clearing his throat. He began to speak, the standard, dispassionate preamble to a sentence that would seal Daniel's fate. In the matter of the state versus Daniel Miller, this court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and pre-sentencing reports. He paused, his gaze finally falling upon Daniel. For a flicker of a second, Daniel thought he saw not condemnation in the judge's eyes, but something else entirely. Agony. The judge gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. His voice was strained as he continued. "Therefore, with regard to the charges brought against the defendant, Daniel Miller." And then it happened. As he spoke Daniel's name, a powerful, undeniable surge of life flooded his legs. It was not a flicker. It was not a spasm. It was a current of pure strength, a vital force he had not felt in 20 years. A guttural cry, a sound of shock and pain and disbelief, was torn from his throat, stunning the courtroom into a collective, silent gasp. With a force that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself, he pushed. He pushed himself up from the chair that had been his prison for 2 decades. He wobbled, his legs shaking violently under his own weight, the black robes trembling around him. The bailiff, his face a mask of disbelief, rushed to his side. "Your Honor!" But the judge waved him away with a sharp, commanding gesture. Leaning heavily on the bench, his entire body shuddering with the monumental effort, he stood. He was no longer just a judge. He was a man undone and remade by a miracle, his face wet with tears that streamed unchecked down his cheeks. He looked directly at Daniel, his voice thick with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him before. A voice broken and reborn. "This court," he announced, his voice booming with newfound power that rattled the very windows, "is in error." A wave of confusion and shock swept the gallery. Marcus Thorne's smug smile froze on his face. "All charges against Daniel Miller," the judge declared, his voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth, "are hereby dismissed. He is a free man." He didn't stop there. He turned his gaze, now as cold and sharp as forged steel, upon Marcus Thorne. "And this court," he said, pointing a trembling but steady finger directly at the stunned rival, "is hereby ordering a full and immediate investigation into the business practices, the assets, and the entire flow of capital of Marcus Thorne and all his family's holdings. Seize the records, all of them." The courtroom erupted. It wasn't loud shouting, but a collective, explosive gasp that sucked the air from the room. Marcus Thorne, who had been frozen in a state of smug disbelief, finally broke. His face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, rising to his feet. "You have no grounds. This is judicial misconduct." 2 large bailiffs, their expressions grim and unmoving, stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The power that had surrounded Marcus his entire life, the invisible armor of his family's wealth, the deference that came with a vast portfolio of assets and a name that opened every door, had just vanished. He was just a man, shouting in a courtroom, and nobody was listening anymore. Across the room, another officer was unlocking Daniel's cuffs. The metallic click was the loudest, most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard. The weight fell from his wrists, and for a moment he just stood there, rubbing the raw skin, feeling the blood return. He looked up, and his gaze found his mother's, the room, the judge, the chaos. It all faded away. There was only Ilara, her face a mess of tears and radiant joy. He moved, his legs unsteady, pushing through the swinging gate of the defendant's box. She met him halfway, and they clung to each other, a silent, desperate embrace that spoke of a month of fear and a lifetime of love. Her small, frail body trembled in his arms, and he buried his face in her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of home. "It's over," he whispered. "It's really over." The aftermath was not a quiet revolution. It was an earthquake. The investigation Judge Finch ordered was not a slow, bureaucratic process. It was a lightning strike, guided by the precise information from the 1998 case file that Arthur Vance officially submitted as new evidence. Within hours, state investigators were at Thorne's corporate headquarters, their warrants signed and sealed. They didn't just seize records, they seized servers, hard drives, and access to offshore accounts. The intricate web of deceit, the digital ghost that had allowed the Thorne family to build a fortune on fraudulent capital, was laid bare. Marcus Thorne was arrested the next day, not in his opulent office, but at his sprawling estate as he was attempting to liquidate some of his more fluid assets. A frantic effort to convert his wealth into untraceable Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The image of the town's great philanthropist in handcuffs on the evening news sent a shockwave through the community. The stories that followed were a cascade of revelations. The immense donations, the public acts of charity, all were funded by a complex scheme of investment fraud. His vast net worth, a towering monument to success, was revealed to be a house of cards built on the ruins of other people's businesses and dreams. His immense holdings in stocks and bonds were frozen, his empire of money and influence crumbling into dust. Weeks passed, and the early autumn chill began to settle over the town. The story of the courtroom miracle became a local legend, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. For Daniel, life was slowly returning to a new kind of normal. The eviction notice was rescinded. Friends and neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid his mother's gaze now stopped by with pies and offers of help. There was a deep, collective shame in the town, a quiet acknowledgement of how quickly they had believed the lie and condemned one of their own. Judge Finch had disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled about his health, but the truth was far simpler. He was learning to walk again. Every day was a battle. Physical therapy sessions left him exhausted, his long dormant muscles screaming in protest. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the profound internal shift. The cynicism that had been his shield for 20 years had been shattered, replaced by a raw, humbling sense of grace. He had been given a gift beyond comprehension, a second chance not just at walking, but at living. One crisp afternoon, about a month after the trial, Daniel and Ilara were sitting on a bench in the town square, watching children play near the fountain. A figure approached them, moving slowly, deliberately, leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane. It was Judge Finch. He wore a simple tweed jacket, not his black robes, and his face, though still stern, had lost its harsh edges. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary humility. He stopped before them, not saying a word for a long moment. There was no grand apology on his lips. They all knew that words were inadequate for the injustice that had been done. But in his eyes, as he looked from Daniel to Ilara, there was a profound acknowledgement of his error, a silent confession of a debt that could never be fully repaid. "Mr. Miller," he finally said, his voice quiet but clear, "your workshop, the fire that was part of the sabotage, the insurance will not be enough to cover the loss of your specialized tools." He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a watch, but for an envelope. "I have considerable personal assets, a lifetime of investments and savings that I no longer have the same use for. I would be honored if you would allow me to finance the complete restoration of your business. Not as charity," he added quickly, seeing Daniel about to protest, "but as an investment in the integrity this town nearly lost." Daniel looked at his mother, who gave him a gentle, encouraging nod. He looked back at the judge, a man who had been reborn, standing before him on his own 2 feet. He saw not a figure of authority, but another human being, flawed and humbled and trying to make amends. He reached out and took the envelope. "Thank you, Judge," he said, the words carrying the weight of forgiveness and a shared, unbelievable journey. "I accept." The final scene shows the protagonist back in his element, the familiar, comforting smell of sawdust in the air, the rhythmic sound of his tools, a song of restoration. His business is thriving, supported by a humbled community eager to make amends. The judge has not only regained the use of his legs, but has found something he lost long ago: his humanity. The mother's impossible prophecy did more than free an innocent man. It forced a cynical world to witness the power of unwavering faith and delivered a justice far more profound than any court could ever dispense. The workshop was rebuilt not just with the judge's money, but with the hands of the community. Men who had once whispered taunts in the prison yard now showed up with tool belts and thermoses of coffee, offering their skills as carpenters and electricians. Women who had averted their eyes from Ilara in the grocery store now organized meal deliveries to the worksite. It was a slow, awkward, but deeply sincere apology written in sweat and sawdust. Daniel's new workshop was better than the old one, larger, with more light streaming through the high windows. But the spirit within it was the same. The rhythmic scrape of a hand plane, the sweet scent of freshly cut oak, the quiet focus of a man who spoke through his craft, it was all back. His business didn't just recover, it flourished. Orders poured in, not just from his town, but from neighboring ones, from people who had heard the story and wanted to own a piece of it, a piece of furniture built by hands that had been cuffed, a testament to integrity that could not be broken. He wasn't just a craftsman anymore, he was a symbol of resilience. Judge Alistair Finch never sat on the bench again. He took an early retirement, stepping away from the system he had served his entire life. But he did not retreat from the world. He was often seen walking through the town square with his cane, no longer an imposing figure of authority, but a quiet, approachable man who would stop to talk to anyone. He used the bulk of his considerable personal fortune, a wealth accumulated through decades of shrewd investments, to establish a legal aid foundation. It was dedicated to providing top-tier defense for those who couldn't afford it, ensuring that no one else would face the machine of justice alone and outmatched. He had lost his faith in the system, but he had found a deeper faith in people. The final perfect image of this quiet revolution came on a warm spring evening, nearly a year later. Daniel stood on the porch of his mother's small house, the house she would never have to leave, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing was the only sound. Ilara sat beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder, her eyes closed in a state of perfect peace. Her faith had not been a desperate gamble. It had been an anchor in the storm, a truth she held when all other truths had been twisted into lies. Her impossible prophecy had done more than free an innocent man and heal a broken one. It had forced a cynical, hurried world to stop and witness something extraordinary. It delivered a justice far more profound than any verdict a court could ever dispense, a justice that healed, restored, and remade the very heart of a community. In the end, it wasn't about a miracle that made a man walk. It was about the simple, unwavering faith that allowed an entire town to stand up and find its humanity again. What did you think of this incredible story of faith and justice? Every person's journey is unique, and sometimes the most unbelievable events teach us the most profound lessons. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the story moved you the most? If you were touched by this story and want to see more content that inspires and uplifts, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.